Dennis Rader and his killer fetishes led him to the name, the BTK Killer, after he pleaded guilty to 10 of his crimes. Dennis Rader was born on March 9, 1945, as the eldest of 4 siblings in Pittsburgh, Kansas, USA, a seemingly quiet place where Dennis, from a very young age, fantasized about abuse and torture. He was someone who, by appearance, wouldn't raise any suspicion, a member of the Lutheran Church and a Boy Scout leader, carefully selecting his victims. This individual sowed fear and terror. It is mentioned that he was withdrawn and characterized as an introverted, quiet boy with many childhood complexes. He used to be cruel to animals, a classic symptom that many psychopaths exhibit in their childhood. He used dogs, cats, and mice, dismembering and killing them, the first victims of his frustrations. From 1965 to 1966, he attended university, subsequently spending 4 years in the U.S. Air Force, where he worked as an aviation technician, living in Texas, Alabama, Okinawa, South Korea, Greece, and Turkey. Upon his return to the U.S., he moved back to Wichita, where he studied electronics and became a justice official. His married life began to unfold in May 1971 with Paula Dietz, with whom he had a son and a daughter. From 1972 to 1973, Rader worked as an embalmer at a company, was employed at a supermarket, and later became a private security officer for the ADT company. He was a member of a Lutheran church near his old high school for approximately 30 years. However, after being fired, he slowly began to mix his fantasies with reality. He had a deep obsession with bondage. Dennis wandered the streets in his car, carefully selecting and observing his victims. He was methodical, leaving nothing to chance, and wanted everything to go well. He spent hours watching their behavior, following them for minutes, learning their routines, and even approaching their mailboxes to learn their names. It was in 1974 when he decided to carry out one of his most elaborate ideas, murdering an entire family, the Oteros. He bought special clothing, a weapon to intimidate, a mask to hide his identity, and, to be more intimidating, ropes and handcuffs, among other things. Later, all these instruments would be part of his killing kit. He had been fantasizing so much about what he would do to Julie Otero and her daughter that, finally, on the morning of January 15, 1974, at 7:30 a.m., he initiated his grand fantasy. He surrounded the house, cut the telephone line, and entered through the back door. He pointed a gun at them and pretended to reassure them, saying he was a fugitive and only intended to eat and flee in his car. Immediately, he tied them up, applying his knowledge as a Boy Scout. He began by tormenting the children in front of the couple, then suffocated the father with a plastic bag tied with ropes around his head. Next was the mother, with whom he fantasized until reaching orgasm, all under the terrified gaze of the children. After finishing, he strangled the little girl until he realized the parents were still alive. He decided to take her upstairs and finish his fantasy. He did the same with the youngest of the family. He stayed there for a moment to ensure that everyone was dead. Then, he collected his things, took the father's watch and a radio, and fled in the family's car, which he left abandoned in a shopping center parking lot. On the same day, the Kansas police received a call from the east side of the city. Young Charlie Otero had returned home from school and found his father and mother dead in their room. Upon arrival, the police discovered the young man's father and mother tied with a blind cord, lying on the bed. After performing the autopsy, they confirmed that none of the victims had suffered sexual assault. Rader later declared that he had planned the crime but lost control of the situation upon entering the house because panic overwhelmed him. He thought the father wouldn't be at home, stating, "I had never strangled anyone before. I didn't know how much pressure to apply or for how long." Just 3 months later, on April 5th of the same year, after the Otero family crime, Dennis killed again. This time, the victims were Tim Bright and his brother Kevin, who, upon entering their home, found an armed man who had broken the glass of the back door. Dennis grabbed Kevin, forcing him to tie his sister to a chair, and taking him to another room where he tried to strangle her. The man defended himself, and Ryder had no choice but to shoot him twice in the back. Nevertheless, Kevin managed to escape from the house. However, when the police arrived, the killer had fled, and inside, they found Catherine still tied to the chair with 3 stab wounds to the abdomen. She would not survive. On August 4th, 1974, Catherine Bright was discovered in her home at 3217 13th Street. Catherine was found partially dressed, bound by a cord, and had been strangled to death, much like the Otero family. Unfortunately, Catherine had also been stabbed several times. Evidence collected from the murder scene of Catherine Bright directly indicated that the BTK killer had committed this murder. Additionally, near the scene, a murder kit was found, which could have belonged to the BTK killer as it contained rope and wire-cutting tools. 3 years later, on March 17, 1977, the Wichita police received a phone call for assistance at 1311 South Hydraulic Street. Upon arrival, they discovered the body of Shirley Vian. Similar to the other victims, Shirley had been bound with a cord, partially dressed, but was suffocated with a plastic bag over her head. Upon further investigation of the house, they found Vian's children locked in the closet. Vian's son, Steve Relford, aged 5, tragically witnessed the entire incident by looking through the keyhole of the door. On December 8, 1977, the Wichita police received another phone call. This time, the police were instructed to go to 843 South Pershing Street. The caller had informed the police that he had the driver's license of the woman he had just murdered. Upon arrival at 843 South Pershing Street, the police found the body of Nancy Jo Fox on the living room floor. Upon investigation, they believed Fox had been killed the night before and had died of strangulation. Again, semen was found, but they concluded that Nancy had not been raped. The police also discovered that Nancy didn't have any defensive wounds, leading them to believe that the BTK killer had very good control over his victims. He was either someone they knew or felt comfortable allowing into their homes. Ryder's phone call speech. How many do I have to kill before I get my name in the paper or some national attention? Do the cops think that all those deaths are not related? Yes, the MO is different in each, but look at the pattern that is developing. The victims are tied up. Most have been women. Phone cut. Bring some bondage mater sadist tendencies. No struggle outside the death spot. No witnesses except the Vian's kids. After a thing like Fox, I come home and go about life like anyone else. And I will be like that until the urge hits me again. After this incident, the BTK killer had gone silent. An investigation team was created to interrogate all the suspects and search for the killer. Eventually, 3 men confessed to being the Otero family killer, and when this news was published in the media, Dennis Rader showed signs of life. He couldn't bear the idea that others would take away the fame for what he had done. Although the police didn't believe those 3 confessions, the killer decided to make sure they knew he was still at large and none of the men who confessed were him. Rader called the telephone line opened by a newspaper and announced that they would get more information about the Otero case if they recovered a letter placed in an engineering textbook on the shelves of the public library, which mentioned the Otero case. He claimed to be the intellectual author of the crime, requesting the release of the 3 suspects. He mentioned that, due to his modus operandi, they now had to know him as BTK, which means bind, torture, kill. After that, Kansas had peace for the next 3 years until BTK returned on March 17, 1977. This time, he entered Shirley's house. 2 of her children stayed home instead of going to school. Around noon, a man knocked on the door and forced his way in, pointing a gun at the children and closing them in the bathroom. A telephonic recording to analyze his voice. The help of a criminal profiling expert was sought, and the story of the BTK killer was broadcast in all national media. Finally, he had fulfilled his dream of becoming famous. Rader's arrogance had increased as he couldn't be stopped, remaining a fugitive for 31 years. On the 27th of April, 1985, the body of Maureen Hedge was discovered. Her body had been relocated from the initial crime scene and discarded elsewhere. Based on the gathered evidence, the police inferred that this murder might be connected to the BTK killings, despite the difference in the disposal of the body compared to other victims who were not moved. The police considered the possibility that it was either a copycat imitating the BTK killer or the potential return of the original BTK killer himself. Then on January 19, 1991, the body of Dolores Davis was discovered near a river in Sedgwick County. Upon investigation, the police determined that she had been abducted from her home and strangled, and once again, her body was relocated and discarded near the river. Nearly 20 years after the initial murder committed by the BTK killer, he continued his criminal activities, leading the police to believe that the serial killer operated on a part-time basis. He could engage in a killing spree, then pause, only to resume his murderous activities years later. This concept was challenging for the police to comprehend, as they had never encountered a part-time serial killer before. He left various cereal boxes with memories of his victims, one of them in the tool store where a surveillance camera recorded his truck. Later, he sent a floppy disk with a text file to the police. Upon analyzing the storage unit, they detected it had been recorded on a computer belonging to the Lutheran Church, where BTK was the president of the parish council. There, they obtained his name, and it was a positive match after comparing his DNA. By 2004, the investigation into the BTK killer had gone cold. Then, Rader initiated a series of communications with the local media. 30 years after the first murder, on March 19, 2004, the Wichita Eagle received a letter from someone using the return address Bill Thomas Kilman. The letter's author claimed responsibility for the murder of Vicki Wegerle on September 16, 1986, and included photographs of the crime scene along with a photocopy of her driver's license, which had been stolen at the time of the crime. Police noted that the body and clothes were rearranged in different positions for each photograph. Before this, it hadn't been definitively established that BTK had killed Wegerle. They ruled out the possibility that these could have been crime scene photos, and is not allowed to be touched until all photo evidence has been taken. Thus, they concluded that these photos must have been taken by the BTK killer. DNA collected from under Wegerle's fingernails provided previously unknown evidence, leading the police to conduct DNA testing on hundreds of men to find the serial killer. In total, over 1,300 DNA samples were taken and later destroyed by court order. The police had now linked Vicki's murder to the BTK killings. The return address on the letter was 1684 South Old Manor. Police promptly went to the location only to find an empty, vacant lot. On May 5, 2004, Cake, Channel 12 in Wichita, Kansas, received a letter containing chapter headings for the BTK story, a word puzzle, and photocopies of 2 employees' identification cards. Neither employee knew how anyone could have possibly obtained photocopies of their identification cards. The police were able to determine that it was the BTK killer who sent the letter. On February 25, 2005, Dennis Ryder was arrested at 60. During more than 30 hours of interrogation, he felt euphoric and wanted to tell them everything. During the trial, his testimony disturbed the audience due to the meticulous and macabre details he provided about each murder. On June 27 of that year, he pleaded guilty to the 10 crimes, and on August 18, 2005, he was sentenced to 10 consecutive life sentences, one for each death. Dennis Ryder may be eligible for parole after serving 175 years in prison, till 2080, ensuring he will never be released. When questioned about his behavior, he stated, "I'm nothing but a good guy who did some bad things." Dennis Ryder, a respectable family man, president of a Lutheran church congregation, and Boy Scouts leader, maintained an impeccable facade of an exemplary citizen who internally harbored the person who has gone down in history as the BTK killer. In 2019, Carrie wrote a book about being Ryder's daughter called A Serial Killer's Daughter: My Story of Faith, Love, and Overcoming. Carrie said that she wrote the book for herself as a way to let go of the anger she was holding inside. What are your thoughts on this story? What do you think led Dennis Ryder to become a sadistic and fetishistic criminal? Let us know in the comments. Thank you for listening, and don't forget to follow for more crime stories.